The morning of October 14th, 1944, began quietly in the small German town of Herrlingen, nestled in the rolling countryside near Ulm. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel woke at 7 o'clock, as was his habit, despite the lingering effects of the devastating head injuries he'd suffered 3 months earlier. The fresh autumn air carried a crispness that hinted at the approaching winter, though the trees still held their October colors, brilliant reds and golds, filtering the early light that streamed through the windows of his modest home. Rommel had breakfast with his wife Lucy, their conversation likely strained by the tension that had hung over their household for weeks now. Gestapo agents had been watching the house, their presence barely concealed, a constant reminder that something terrible was brewing on the horizon. After breakfast, Rommel took a walk through his garden with his 15-year-old son, Manfred, who had returned from military service just the night before at his father's personal request. As they strolled among the trees and hedges Rommel had carefully tended, the field marshal's trained eye counted 5 trucks full of armed men in civilian clothes positioned around the property. He told Manfred that a couple of generals from Berlin would be arriving at noon, and though he tried to maintain his composure, the worry was evident in his voice. Most of his friends and associates had already been arrested or executed in the massive purge that followed the failed assassination attempt on Hitler back in July. Rommel hoped for the best outcome from this visit, perhaps reassignment to the Eastern Front, but deep down, he must have known that hope was a fragile thing in Nazi Germany in the autumn of 1944. Before the generals arrived, Rommel changed into his Afrika Korps tunic, the uniform that had become synonymous with his greatest triumphs, and the nickname that would outlive him by decades. The Desert Fox was about to face his final battle, but this time there would be no cunning tactical maneuver, no brilliant flanking movement to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. This time, the enemy had already won, and Rommel knew it. The man who had been Hitler's favorite general, who had earned the respect even of his enemies on the battlefield, who had become a legend in his own time, was about to be consumed by the very regime he had served with such distinction. The tragedy of Erwin Rommel's end lies not just in the manner of his death, but in how a career built on courage and tactical genius could be brought down not by superior forces on the battlefield, but by the paranoid machinery of totalitarian politics. The making of a legend in desert sands. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold on that October morning, we need to trace back to the origins of Rommel's legendary status. In February 1941, when Rommel arrived in Libya to take command of the German forces being sent to shore up a collapsing Italian position in North Africa, few could have predicted the transformation that was about to occur. The situation facing the Germans and their Italian allies was dire. British and Commonwealth forces had recently inflicted a series of humiliating defeats on the Italians, pushing them back across hundreds of miles of desert and capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. The Italian military leadership was in disarray, morale was shattered, and it seemed only a matter of time before the entire Italian presence in North Africa would collapse entirely. But Rommel was not a man to follow conventional wisdom or accept defensive postures when aggressive action might change the game. Despite receiving orders to simply hold his position and prevent further Italian losses, Rommel immediately went on the offensive. Leading from the very front, often positioning himself dangerously close to the fighting in a way that would make his superiors back in Berlin blanch with worry, he pushed the understrength British and Commonwealth forces back toward the Egyptian border. His tactics were unconventional, daring, and spectacularly effective. He had an almost supernatural ability to sense weakness in enemy positions and exploit them with lightning speed, using his armor in ways that seemed to defy the limitations of desert logistics and the harsh environment. The British found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. Rommel's attacks came from unexpected directions, at unexpected times, with an audacity that left them scrambling to respond. He would feint in one direction, then strike from another. He understood intuitively how to use the vast, empty spaces of the desert to his advantage, how to make his forces appear larger than they were, how to keep his enemies off balance and reactive rather than proactive. His personal courage was legendary among both his own troops and the enemy. He thought nothing of driving to the front in his command vehicle, studying the battlefield through binoculars, while shells burst around him, personally directing units into position with hand signals when radio communication failed. It was this combination of tactical brilliance and fearless leadership that earned him the nickname that would define him forever: the Desert Fox. The name came from both sides. His own soldiers called him this with a mixture of pride and affection, recognizing in him a commander who shared their hardships and led them to victories they had thought impossible. But remarkably, his British adversaries also adopted the name, using it with a grudging respect that was rare in the brutal theater of war. There was something about Rommel that transcended the usual hatreds of combat. He fought what he called a war without hate, treating prisoners with courtesy, forbidding reprisals against civilians, and conducting himself with a chivalry that seemed to belong to an earlier age of warfare. His greatest triumph came in June 1942, with the capture of the fortress port of Tobruk, which had withstood previous assaults and stood as a symbol of British resistance in North Africa. When Tobruk finally fell to Rommel's forces after a brilliantly executed assault, Hitler was so impressed that he promoted Rommel to the rank of Field Marshal on the spot, making him the youngest officer to achieve that rank in the German military. At 50, Rommel stood at the pinnacle of military achievement, his name known throughout the world, his tactical innovations studied in military academies, his reputation for brilliance seemingly unassailable. But even as Rommel reached these heights, the seeds of his eventual downfall were already being sown. The very qualities that made him brilliant in the field, his independence, his willingness to ignore orders he deemed foolish, his tendency to speak his mind regardless of political consequences, would eventually bring him into conflict with the Nazi leadership. And the tides of war, which had seemed so favorable to Germany in those early desert campaigns, were beginning to turn inexorably against the Axis powers. From triumph to retreat, the turning tide. The North African campaign that had made Rommel's reputation would also reveal its limitations. Despite his tactical genius, Rommel struggled with logistics, the unglamorous but essential business of keeping an army supplied in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Afrika Korps was fighting at the end of a supply line that stretched across the Mediterranean, constantly harassed by British naval and air forces. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every spare part for the tanks and vehicles had to be shipped from Europe, and the losses to Allied interdiction were staggering. Rommel discovered to his frustration that he was losing as much as 50% of all fuel landed in North Africa before it could reach his forces at the front. His aggressive tactics, brilliant as they were, consumed resources at a rate that the German war machine simply could not sustain. He requested thousands of additional trucks just to maintain his supply lines. The vast distances of the desert meant that a significant portion of the precious fuel reaching Africa was burned simply in the process of transporting more fuel to the front lines. It was a logistical nightmare that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Hitler, viewing the North African theater as a sideshow compared to the titanic struggle unfolding on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, was unwilling to commit the resources that Rommel desperately needed. The British, meanwhile, were learning from their defeats. They began to match and then exceed Rommel's tactical innovations, while their material superiority, backed by American industrial might, grew month by month. In October and November 1942, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, Rommel faced a reinvigorated British Eighth Army under the command of General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery, having studied Rommel's tactics carefully, refused to be drawn into the kind of fluid, mobile battle where Rommel excelled. Instead, he used his overwhelming superiority in men and material to grind away at the German and Italian positions in a battle of attrition that Rommel could not win. Rommel fought brilliantly in defense, using every trick in his considerable playbook to delay the inevitable. But there was no escaping the mathematics of the situation. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and running dangerously low on fuel and ammunition. When he finally requested permission to withdraw and preserve his forces, Hitler initially forbade it, ordering him to hold his position to the last man. It was Rommel's first significant clash with Hitler's strategic judgment, a conflict that would deepen over the remaining 2 years of his life. Eventually, Rommel was allowed to retreat, conducting a masterful fighting withdrawal across North Africa. But the writing was on the wall. The Afrika Korps would eventually be trapped in Tunisia along with other Axis forces, and though Rommel himself was recalled to Germany before the final surrender in May 1943, the desert campaigns that had made him famous were over. He left Africa exhausted, dispirited, and increasingly disillusioned with Hitler's leadership. The man who had arrived in Libya confident in Germany's ultimate victory was returning with grave doubts about the direction of the war and the competence of the Nazi leadership. Assignment to the Atlantic Wall. After a period of recovery and reassignment to Italy, where he oversaw the disarming of Italian forces after that country's surrender to the Allies, Rommel received what would be his final major command. In November 1943, he was assigned as General Inspector of the Western Defenses, tasked with preparing the Atlantic coast of occupied France for the massive Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. It was a command that would test Rommel in entirely new ways, forcing him to shift from the mobile, aggressive warfare he had mastered in the desert to the static defense of hundreds of miles of coastline. When Rommel arrived in France to inspect the Atlantic Wall, the massive defensive line that Hitler had ordered constructed along the coast, he was appalled by what he found. Despite years of construction and enormous expenditures of concrete and steel, the defenses were woefully incomplete and inadequately manned. There were gaps in coverage, critical areas left undefended, and a general lack of the depth and intensity that Rommel knew would be necessary to stop a determined Allied assault. The propaganda about the invincibility of the Atlantic Wall bore little resemblance to the reality on the ground. Rommel threw himself into improving the defenses with characteristic energy. He ordered massive increases in the mining of beaches and coastal waters, demanding millions of mines to create killing zones that would exact a terrible price from any invasion force. He designed and implemented what became known as Rommel's asparagus, wooden poles erected in open fields and meadows behind the coast to prevent the landing of Allied gliders and paratroopers. He had these poles wired together and topped with mines, creating a deadly obstacle network. He ordered the flooding of low-lying areas to channel invading forces into carefully prepared killing zones. He worked to multiply the number of concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, and beach obstacles, driving his subordinates relentlessly to strengthen every vulnerable point along hundreds of miles of coastline. But Rommel faced obstacles that no amount of energy or tactical skill could overcome. There simply wasn't enough time, enough material, or enough manpower to create the kind of defense he envisioned. The cement factory in Cherbourg had to close due to lack of coal. Allied air raids constantly disrupted supply lines. Where the plan called for 10 million mines for a single division's front, only 10,000 were delivered. The daily requirement for cement was 240 truckloads, but often only a fraction of that amount arrived. Rommel found himself fighting bureaucratic battles that were as frustrating as any he had faced against the British in North Africa. Except now the obstacles came from his own side. More fundamentally, Rommel found himself in strategic disagreement with his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West. The disagreement centered on a crucial question: where should Germany's powerful panzer divisions be positioned when the invasion came? Rommel, having experienced firsthand the devastating power of Allied air superiority in North Africa, was convinced that the panzers had to be positioned close to the coast. He believed that once the Allies landed, their complete control of the air would make it impossible to move large armored formations to the battle. The tanks had to be there on the beaches, ready to counterattack immediately, to throw the invaders back into the sea in the first crucial hours. Von Rundstedt disagreed fundamentally with this assessment. He favored the traditional approach of holding the panzers back as a mobile reserve, waiting to see where the main Allied thrust would come, then launching a massive concentrated counterattack. He worried that tanks positioned close to the coast would be vulnerable to naval bombardment from Allied warships. It was a strategic debate with no clear right answer, and Hitler, unable or unwilling to choose between his two field marshals, created a compromise that satisfied neither man and weakened the overall defense. Some panzer divisions were positioned near the coast as Rommel wanted, while others were held back as von Rundstedt preferred. But crucially, Hitler retained personal control over their movement. meaning that no one could move them without his explicit authorization. The fateful summer of 1944. When D-Day finally came on June 6, 1944, Rommel was not even in France. He had traveled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to attempt to secure a personal meeting with Hitler to plead once more for additional resources and authority to position the panzers where he believed they needed to be. The invasion caught the German high command by surprise, despite all the intelligence suggesting that it was imminent. Hitler, convinced that the Normandy landings were merely a feint and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, refused to authorize the movement of the panzer reserves to Normandy for crucial hours. When Rommel rushed back to France and saw the situation developing, he must have felt a terrible sense of vindication mixed with despair. Everything he had feared was coming to pass. Allied air power dominated the skies, making movement of German forces in daylight virtually suicidal. The panzers that might have driven the Allies back into the sea on the first day were stuck miles inland, unable to concentrate for a proper counterattack. The one armored division that had been positioned close to the coast as a concession to Rommel's theories, the 21st Panzer Division, launched an immediate counterattack on D-Day and actually broke through to the coast between Sword and Juno beaches, demonstrating what might have been possible with more forces. But without support, they had to withdraw. Rommel did his best to direct the defense of Normandy in the weeks that followed, but he was fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds. The Allies were pouring men and material into their expanding beachheads faster than the Germans could reinforce their own positions. Allied fighter bombers prowled the skies relentlessly, attacking anything that moved during daylight hours. German forces were being fed piecemeal into a meat grinder, exactly the kind of war of attrition that Rommel knew Germany could not win. He proposed pulling back to regroup and counterattack from a position of strength, but Hitler would not hear of it. Every yard of French soil was to be held to the last man. The stress and frustration were taking their toll on Rommel. The man who had always been so confident in his ability to find a tactical solution to any problem was increasingly confronting the reality that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome strategic incompetence at the highest levels. He began making statements to his staff and fellow officers that would later come back to haunt him, suggesting that Hitler had to be removed from command, that Germany needed to seek terms with the Western Allies before the country was completely destroyed. On July 17, 1944, Rommel was returning from a visit to the headquarters of the 1st SS Panzer Corps near Évril when his staff car was attacked by Allied fighter aircraft. The exact identity of the pilot has been debated, with credit claimed for both a South African flying a Spitfire and a Canadian pilot, but the result was devastating regardless of who pulled the trigger. The Allied fighter strafed the road, cannon shells tearing into Rommel's unescorted Horch staff car. His driver was mortally wounded and lost control of the vehicle, which veered into trees and crashed. Rommel, who characteristically had been riding in the front passenger seat rather than the relative safety of the rear, was either thrown from the car during the attack or jumped out to escape the hail of shells. Either way, he struck the road surface at high speed. The left side of his face was torn up by glass fragments and contact with the pavement. He suffered 3 skull fractures that by all rights should have killed him on the spot. Incredibly, he survived, though he was unconscious and in critical condition when he was rushed to a French hospital. The wounds were so severe that it initially appeared he would not survive, and even if he did, there were fears he might suffer permanent brain damage. But Rommel's legendary toughness saw him through. He slowly recovered consciousness and began the long process of recuperation. By October, he was well enough to be convalescing at his home in Herrlingen, though he still suffered from severe headaches and was far from fully recovered. He had been fortunate in a way he couldn't yet appreciate. The crash had removed him from active command just 3 days before an event that would change everything: the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. The Conspiracy Unveiled. On July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg entered Hitler's field headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, carrying a briefcase packed with explosives. This was the culmination of years of planning by elements of the German military and civilian leadership who had come to believe that Hitler was leading Germany to complete destruction and that his removal was the only way to save the nation. Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers from his left hand in an Allied air attack in North Africa, had become one of the key figures in the resistance network. He placed the briefcase under the conference table where Hitler was meeting with his top military advisors and then excused himself. Minutes later, the bomb exploded with devastating force, tearing apart the conference hut, killing 4 men outright and wounding many others. But Hitler, protected by the heavy oak table and by pure chance, survived with only minor injuries. The table leg had stood between him and the blast, and someone had moved the briefcase farther away from Hitler just before it exploded. The Führer emerged from the wreckage shaken but alive, and once he recovered his composure, his rage was terrible to behold. What followed was one of the most brutal purges in Nazi Germany's bloody history. The Gestapo launched a massive investigation to root out everyone even peripherally connected to the plot. Thousands of people were arrested. Interrogations were conducted with savage brutality, torture was routine, and confessions were extracted under circumstances that made their reliability questionable at best. The conspirators who survived the initial roundup were brought before Roland Freisler's People's Court, where they were subjected to show trials designed to humiliate them before their inevitable executions. Hitler personally ordered that those convicted should be hanged like cattle, and his orders were carried out with horrific literalness. Some conspirators were executed by being hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, their death agonies filmed for Hitler's viewing. Others chose suicide rather than face the People's Court. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Rommel in command in France and had been implicated in the plot, killed himself with cyanide. The executions went on for months, consuming military officers, government officials, clergy, intellectuals, anyone whom the investigation touched. As the dragnet widened and the interrogations grew more brutal, Rommel's name began to appear in the testimonies of the accused. General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the military governor of Paris, who had been deeply involved in the conspiracy, was badly wounded in a suicide attempt after the plot's failure. In his delirium, recovering in a hospital bed, he repeatedly muttered Rommel's name. Under torture, Caesar von Hofacker, a Luftwaffe officer connected to the resistance, stated that he had informed Rommel of the coming coup when he visited Rommel's headquarters at La Roche-Guyon on July 9th. Even more damning, papers belonging to Karl Gödler, who had been intended to serve as chancellor in a post-Hitler government, were discovered to contain lists of potential government officials. On one of these lists, Rommel was named as a potential Reich president, though it seems this plan was never actually discussed with Rommel himself. The evidence was fragmentary, the testimonies often extracted under duress, but it was enough for Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy, to build a case. The truth about Rommel's involvement remains murky even today. The evidence discovered in 2018, including photographs of Rommel meeting with resistance leaders and accounts from surviving conspirators, suggests he was aware that something was being planned and had indicated general support for the idea of removing Hitler from power. However, it appears that Rommel was opposed to assassination, preferring instead to arrest Hitler and put him on trial for his crimes. He apparently feared that Hitler's murder might trigger a civil war within Germany, pitting factions of the military against each other at the worst possible moment. Whether Rommel would have taken active steps to support the conspiracy will never be known. His injuries from the July 17th car crash removed him from any possibility of direct involvement in the July 20th plot. Had he been healthy and in command, would he have ordered his forces in the West to support the coup? Would his immense prestige have been enough to bring other wavering commanders into the fold? These are historical what-ifs that can never be answered definitively, but they must have tormented Hitler and his closest advisors as they contemplated what to do about Germany's most famous and beloved general. The Noose tightens. By late September 1944, as Rommel continued his recovery in Herrlingen, the evidence compiled against him was presented to Hitler. It was fragmentary and circumstantial, built on the testimony of men who had been tortured or were facing death. But in the paranoid atmosphere of Nazi Germany in the fall of 1944, it was more than enough. On September 27th, Bormann submitted a memorandum to Hitler stating that Stülpnagel, Hofacker, and other defendants had testified that Rommel knew about the assassination plan and had promised to serve in a new government after Hitler's removal. Hitler faced a delicate problem. Rommel was not just another general who could be quietly arrested, tried, and executed. He was a national hero, probably the most popular and respected military figure in Germany. His victories in North Africa had made him a household name. The propaganda machine had built him up as the ideal German soldier, brave, honorable, tactically brilliant, the son of a schoolteacher who had risen to the highest ranks through merit rather than aristocratic birth. To publicly brand Rommel as a traitor and subject him to the humiliation of the People's Court would be a public relations disaster for the Nazi regime. Moreover, there was the practical consideration that Germany was now fighting desperately on multiple fronts. The Red Army was driving westward through Eastern Europe. The Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and were advancing toward Germany itself. Italy had already changed sides. The last thing the Nazi leadership needed was anything that might further damage military morale or cause more officers to question their loyalty to the regime. If Rommel could be vocal from the dock of the People's Court, if he could use that platform to condemn Hitler's conduct of the war, the damage could be incalculable. A court-martial board was convened to pass judgment on Rommel, incredibly without his knowledge. The board included Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had disagreed with Rommel on strategy but had probably secretly supported his position against Hitler's interference. Also on the board was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, known derisively as Lekeitel, for his absolute subservience to Hitler. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, who would himself later come into conflict with Hitler over the conduct of the war on the Eastern Front, and General Heinrich Kirchheim, whom Rommel had relieved of command after the Battle of Tobruk in 1941, and who might be expected to harbor a grudge. Despite the questionable nature of the evidence, the court found Rommel guilty. Hitler and his inner circle then had to decide on a course of action that would remove the threat they believed Rommel posed while avoiding the public relations catastrophe of a trial. They settled on a solution that was elegant in its cruelty. They would give Rommel a choice, but it would be a choice between different forms of death, with only the manner and the consequences for his family varying. Gestapo surveillance of Rommel's home intensified in early October. The house in Herrlingen was watched constantly. Rommel, seeing the men stationed around his property, must have known that his time was running out. He had lived through enough of the Third Reich's purges to understand how these things worked. He had seen too many of his fellow officers disappear, heard too many official announcements of suicides and heart attacks that fooled no one, to have any illusions about what was coming. The final morning. On October 14, 1944, the machinery that had been set in motion reached its inexorable conclusion. After his morning walk with Manfred, Rommel went inside to wait for his visitors. At noon precisely, two staff cars pulled up to the house. General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Meisel emerged, both men, Hitler loyalists, who could be trusted to carry out orders without question or mercy. They greeted Rommel politely and requested to speak with him in private. What happened in that private conversation has been reconstructed from Rommel's account to his family afterward, and from post-war statements by the survivors. The generals informed Rommel of the charges against him, that he had been implicated in the July 20th plot. That testimony from multiple sources indicated his knowledge of and support for the conspiracy to remove Hitler from power. Whether they presented all the evidence or just selected pieces, whether they themselves believed in Rommel's guilt or were simply following orders, we cannot know with certainty. Then they presented him with his three options, though calling them options seems almost cruel, given that they all led to the same destination by different routes. First, he could return to Berlin with them to defend himself before Hitler personally. But the generals made clear that this would be taken as an admission of guilt, and Hitler had already signed off on his death. Second, he could face trial before the People's Court, that travesty of justice where Roland Freisler screamed abuse at defendants who were given no real opportunity to defend themselves, and where every trial ended in conviction and death. If he chose this path, not only would he die, but his family would be arrested and sent to concentration camps, his staff would be arrested and likely tortured and executed, and his name and reputation would be destroyed. Or, third, he could commit suicide immediately. If he chose this option, he would be given a cyanide capsule. His death would be attributed to the injuries he had sustained in the July 17th car crash, complications from his skull fractures that had finally proven fatal. He would be accorded a state funeral with full military honors. His family would be left alone and would continue to receive his full field marshal's pension. His reputation would remain intact, his legacy as Germany's greatest general untarnished in the official record. It wasn't really a choice at all, and everyone in that room knew it. Rommel could choose to die quietly and protect his family, or he could choose to die publicly and destroy them in the process. For a man like Rommel, who had always put duty and the welfare of those under his command above personal considerations, there was only one possible answer. Rommel requested time to inform his family of what was happening. The generals agreed, but stipulated that his family must never reveal the truth of his death. Rommel found Manfred and told him in a tense voice, "In 15 minutes, I will die." Shocked, the 15-year-old boy asked if they couldn't defend themselves, if they couldn't fight back. Rommel, ever the tactician even in this darkest hour, explained that it was pointless. "Better one to die than all of us to die in a gunfight," he said. There were Gestapo agents positioned all around the property with orders to storm the house and shoot Rommel down if he resisted. Lucy and Manfred would almost certainly be killed in the crossfire. Rommel's old friend, Hermann Aldinger, his personal adjutant who had fought alongside him since World War I, was also present. The generals had tried to keep Aldinger occupied so that Rommel could speak privately with his family, but Manfred called him upstairs. When Aldinger learned what was happening, he was outraged and wanted to fight, to die beside his commander and friend, rather than let him be murdered by these Nazi thugs. But Rommel calmed him, just as he had calmed Manfred. There was no point in resistance that would only get more people killed. Rommel climbed the stairs to say a final goodbye to his wife. The exact words they exchanged remain private, known only to them, but we can imagine the grief and rage and helplessness they must have felt. After 40 years of marriage, after surviving one world war together, and watching their son grow up, after all the triumphs and setbacks of a military career that had taken them from obscurity to the heights of fame, it came down to this: a quiet murder dressed up in the language of honor and choice. Rommel came back downstairs and began preparing to leave. He put on his leather coat, his movements deliberate and controlled. Then he pulled out his wallet and examined its contents, asking the practical question that revealed how even in this moment he was thinking clearly. "There are 150 marks here. Should I take the money with me?" Such a mundane concern in such an extraordinary moment. He decided to leave the money for his family. Before he left, he told Aldinger exactly what would happen next. In a quarter of an hour, Aldinger would receive a phone call from the Wagner School Hospital in Ulm, informing him that Field Marshal Rommel had suffered a cerebral seizure on the way to a conference and had died. It was all arranged, all scripted, down to the smallest detail. The regime's murder of its greatest general would be packaged as a tragic medical event, sold to the German public as another sacrifice in the great struggle. Rommel stepped outside, accompanied by Manfred and Aldinger, stopping once to prevent his beloved Dachshund from following him. He spoke a final warning to his son. "Manfred, I think Speidel is also finished. Take care of Frau Speidel." He was referring to Hans Speidel, his former chief of staff who had introduced him to the resistance leaders and who would indeed be arrested, though he would eventually be released after managing to convince the Gestapo of his innocence. The villagers of Herrlingen witnessed Rommel's last goodbye to his son and old comrade, quick handshakes that betrayed none of the emotion roiling beneath the surface. Rommel climbed into the back seat of the staff car. Burgdorf and Meisel climbed in on either side of him, boxing him in to prevent any possibility of escape. At the wheel sat SS Stabsscharführer Heinrich Dose, a driver from Hitler's personal motor pool, a man whose loyalty to the regime was absolute. The drive to death. The car drove up the steep hill from Herrlingen, away from the village and away from potential witnesses, heading toward a quiet, wooded area, about 15 minutes from Rommel's home. The road climbed through dense forest before emerging into more open fields. It was a beautiful October day, the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes the German countryside so appealing, but Rommel was seeing it all for the last time, and he must have known it. What did he think about during that short drive? Did he replay the great campaigns in his mind? The lightning advances across the desert? The desperate defenses in Normandy? Did he think about all the decisions that had led him to this moment? The choices to serve Hitler, to follow orders even when he disagreed with them, to become so famous and so valuable to the regime that he became dangerous when he started to have doubts? Did he regret anything? Or did he believe that he had always done his duty as he understood it? The accounts of what happened when the car stopped are contradictory and unreliable. The only witnesses were the two generals and the SS driver, all of whom were complicit in Rommel's death and had every reason to shade their accounts to minimize their own guilt. According to one version, the driver stepped away from the car for 10 minutes, and when he returned, he found Rommel sobbing in death throes. But this seems unlikely given the type of cyanide capsule that was used, which typically kills in about 3 minutes. General Mazel, who survived the war, claimed he was not present in the car when Rommel died, and that it was Bergdorf who stayed with him. But Bergdorf, conveniently for Mazel's account, committed suicide in Hitler's bunker in May 1945, and could not contradict this version of events. The SS driver claimed that Rommel's service cap and field marshal's baton fell from him in the car, but post-war investigations revealed that these items were actually taken as trophies by the Nazis and later displayed on a desk at Hitler's headquarters, where they were shown to visitors. Hermann Aldinger eventually managed to recover these items in November 1944 and return them to Rommel's family. A doctor named Friedrich Breiderhoff was later forced at gunpoint to examine Rommel's body and attempt resuscitation for show, even though Rommel was clearly already dead. Breiderhoff found the empty cyanide capsule, but was forced to write the death certificate attributing Rommel's death to a heart attack, continuing the fiction that would be sold to the German public. What is certain is that Rommel died in that car, on that quiet wooded road, far from the spotlight of fame and the glory of battle, murdered by the regime he had served. His body was then driven to an army field hospital. Exactly 15 minutes later, as Rommel had predicted, the phone call came to Aldinger informing him of the field marshal's sudden death. The machinery of the cover-up was operating precisely as planned. The state funeral and the Lies Hitler ordered a day of national mourning to mark the passing of Germany's greatest general. The state funeral was held in Ulm, as Rommel had requested in his final moments. It was a grand affair, attended by high-ranking military officers and Nazi officials, all of them maintaining the fiction that this was a tragic loss due to injuries sustained in the line of duty rather than a carefully orchestrated murder. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had been on the court-martial board that condemned Rommel, delivered the eulogy. One wonders what he was thinking as he stood there praising Rommel's service to the Führer and the Reich, knowing the truth of how the Desert Fox had really died. Was it pure cynicism, or did he believe he was doing Rommel a service by maintaining the lie that protected Rommel's family and reputation? Perhaps it was simply the survival instinct of a man living in a totalitarian state, doing what he had to do to avoid joining Rommel in the grave. The German public mourned sincerely, believing the official story. To them, Rommel had been a genuine hero, the rare bright spot in a war that was increasingly going badly for Germany. His death was seen as another tragedy in a long string of tragedies that the war had brought. The truth would not emerge until after the war ended, when survivors began to tell their stories, and documents came to light revealing the reality behind the carefully constructed facade. After the funeral, the Gestapo had Rommel's body cremated, ostensibly out of respect, but actually to destroy any evidence of the real cause of death. The cyanide poisoning would have been detectable in an autopsy, and the regime wanted no possibility of the truth emerging to contradict the official narrative. Rommel was then buried in Herrlingen, close to Ulm, in a grave that would become a pilgrimage site for those who admired the military genius of the Desert Fox, most of them unaware for years of the true circumstances of his death. The men who carried out Hitler's orders regarding Rommel met varied fates. General Wilhelm Burgdorf shot himself in Hitler's bunker on May 2, 1945, shortly before it was captured by Soviet forces, and just 2 days after Hitler's own suicide. To the end, he remained a loyal Nazi, choosing death over the possibility of capture and trial for his crimes. General Ernst Maisel survived the war and was released from U.S. captivity in 1947. He lived quietly in Bavaria until his death in 1978 at the age of 82, carrying the secret of his role in Rommel's death for more than 30 years before finally speaking about it. SS driver Heinrich Deuss took part in the desperate breakout from Hitler's bunker on May 1, 1945, as the Red Army closed in on the last remnants of the Nazi regime. He was later captured and interrogated by American forces about Rommel's death, but his ultimate fate remains unclear, lost in the chaos of the war's final days and its aftermath. What might have been? The historian cannot help but wonder about the what-ifs that surround Rommel's story. If his staff car had not been shot up by that Allied fighter on July 17th, if he had remained in command in the West, what role might he have played in the July 20th plot? The evidence suggests that while he was not in the inner circle of the conspiracy and was not directly involved in planning the assassination attempt, he had been approached by resistance leaders and had indicated at least tacit support for the idea of removing Hitler from power. Rommel had the respect of a large portion of the German army and was enormously popular with the German public. If he had been healthy and in command when the July 20th plot was executed, and if the assassination attempt had actually succeeded in killing Hitler, would Rommel have used his prestige and authority to bring other Western Front commanders into line behind the coup? Would the resistance have been able to seize control of the government with Rommel as the face of the new regime, or at least as someone willing to negotiate with the Western allies for an armistice? We know from documents discovered in 2018 that there were meetings between Rommel and resistance leaders, including Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, in the months before the July plot. We know from intercepted conversations between German generals in British captivity that Heinrich Eberbach reported Rommel telling him in June 1944 that Hitler and his closest associates would have to be killed as the only way out for Germany. The evidence suggests that Rommel had been brought into the conspiracy's orbit, even if he remained on its periphery, rather than in its core. But the historical record also shows Rommel's reluctance to take decisive action in support of the conspiracy. According to his widow and to statements attributed to him, he was opposed to assassination, fearing it might trigger civil war within Germany. He apparently preferred the idea of arresting Hitler and putting him on trial, a fantasy that showed Rommel's political naivety even as it demonstrated his continued adherence to concepts of law and justice that had long since ceased to have any meaning in Nazi Germany. The truth is probably that Rommel was a man caught between his military oath of loyalty, his growing recognition that Hitler was leading Germany to catastrophe, his desire to see the war end before Germany was completely destroyed, and his reluctance to take the kind of decisive treasonous action that would have been required to actually change the course of events. He was a tactical genius, but not a political revolutionary. He was brave under fire, but not necessarily ready to commit what would technically be treason against the state he had sworn to serve. If the July 20th plot had succeeded, if Hitler had actually been killed by Stauffenberg's bomb, would Rommel have acted decisively then? Would he have used his authority as a field marshal to secure the Western Front for the new government? Would he have been able to convince other commanders, including von Rundstedt, to support the coup? These are questions that can never be answered with certainty, but they have occupied historians for decades and will continue to do so. What we can say with certainty is that Rommel's injuries removed him from any possibility of active participation in the plot, and that may have been one of the crucial factors in its failure. The conspirators had hoped to rely on Rommel's prestige in the West, just as they had hoped to rely on other commanders in other theaters. Without Rommel, without his reputation and his popularity, the resistance lost a potentially powerful asset. Whether that would have been enough to make the difference between success and failure is impossible to know, but it certainly didn't help their cause. The tragedy of a military genius. Erwin Rommel's story is ultimately a tragedy in the classical sense. Here was a man of genuine military genius, a tactical innovator whose campaigns are still studied in military academies around the world, a leader who commanded the respect and loyalty of his troops and the grudging admiration of his enemies. He rose from relatively modest origins to the highest ranks of his profession through demonstrated ability and courage. He fought with honor in a war increasingly characterized by war crimes and atrocities, maintaining standards of conduct that stood in stark contrast to the brutality displayed by many of his colleagues, especially on the Eastern Front. Yet, this same man served the Nazi regime. He accepted honors and promotions from Hitler. He allowed himself to be used for propaganda purposes, becoming the public face of German military prowess even as the regime he served was committing genocide on an industrial scale. When he finally came to recognize that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction, when he finally began to consider the necessity of removing the Führer from power, he did so not out of moral opposition to Nazism, but out of practical recognition that the war was unwinnable and that Germany needed to find a way out before it was completely destroyed. Rommel was not a Nazi ideologue. He never joined the Nazi Party. There is no evidence that he shared Hitler's virulent anti-Semitism or supported the Holocaust, though as a senior military commander, he could not have been entirely ignorant of what was happening. He appears to have been a man focused primarily on military matters, willing to overlook or ignore the political and ideological dimensions of the regime he served, as long as he was allowed to do his job and lead his troops. This makes him a more complex and ambiguous figure than either his admirers or his detractors sometimes want to acknowledge. He was neither the pure heroic figure portrayed in some accounts, nor the willing tool of Nazi evil suggested by others. He was a talented soldier who served a monstrous regime, a man who came late to the recognition that something was fundamentally wrong, and who paid the ultimate price for that recognition when it finally came. His death marks one of the final acts of the July 20th plot's tragic aftermath. The massive purge that followed the failed assassination attempt consumed thousands of Germans, military and civilian alike, in a frenzy of paranoid revenge that weakened Germany's ability to continue the war, even as it eliminated anyone who might pose a threat to Hitler's absolute control. By forcing Rommel to commit suicide, the Nazi regime eliminated its most famous and capable field commander at a time when Germany desperately needed every advantage it could find in its increasingly hopeless struggle against the Allied powers, closing in from all sides. Within 7 months of Rommel's death, the war in Europe would be over. Hitler would commit suicide in his bunker as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. The 1,000-year Reich that was supposed to last an eternity would lie in ruins, its leaders dead or fleeing, its armies destroyed, its cities devastated. One cannot help but wonder if things might have been different if Rommel had been allowed to live, to use his tactical brilliance in the final desperate defense of Germany, or perhaps to negotiate some kind of separate peace with the Western Allies that might have spared Germany the full horror of its final months of war and the complete destruction that followed. But that is not what happened. Instead, on a quiet October day in 1944, on a wooded road near a small German town, the Desert Fox met his end not in battle, but through the cold-blooded calculation of a regime that valued loyalty above all else and saw any questioning of its policies as treason worthy of death. Rommel's tragedy was to serve that regime too well and too faithfully for too long, and then to recognize too late that his duty as a German officer might require him to act against the leader who had promoted him to field marshal. The exact truth of Rommel's involvement with the resistance, the depth of his commitment to removing Hitler from power, the actions he might have taken had he not been injured in July 1944, these will continue to be debated by historians as long as people study the Second World War. What cannot be debated is that Erwin Rommel was a military commander of exceptional ability whose talent was ultimately wasted by the regime he served, and who met his death not as a soldier on the battlefield, but as a victim of political murder, forced to choose between a quiet death that protected his family or a public trial that would destroy them. Remembering the Desert Fox. If you found this exploration of one of history's most complex military figures compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to WW2 Echoes for more deep dives into the untold stories and fascinating personalities of the Second World War. The story of Erwin Rommel reminds us that history is rarely as simple as we might wish it to be, that heroes and villains are often more complicated than popular narratives suggest, and that the consequences of serving evil regimes can be tragic even for those who try to maintain their honor within that service. Share your thoughts in the comments below about Rommel's legacy and the moral complexities of his story. Until next time, this has been WW2 Echoes, keeping alive the voices and lessons of history's greatest conflict.